Eva. Wonderful what you've been doing in 10 years. If everybody would accomplish that much in 10 years, the world would be in better shape. That is for sure. Thanks for what you're doing. You know, I have a little bit of a problem. I don't come from the fashion industry. I don't know the fashion industry, but the more I actually study it and look at it, the more I get excited about the opportunities. But my problem is a big one. My problem is that we've had such wonderful speakers before us, with Her Royal Highness Eva and François-Henri Pinault, that they've basically summarized already sort of what I was going to say in my speech. So Houston, we have a problem. So I decided to just ditch the notes and just go into a different direction and make more use of the time, your scarce and precious time that you have. The closest I get to fashion is actually today, with the generous help of Caring, I'm actually wearing something that is decent. My wife said, I don't recognize you anymore. I even put socks on that are called Conscious Steps, a very good company in the US, that if you buy socks, they donate to water or to literacy or fighting HIV, the LGBT community. So I love fashion the more I get into it. But here's the issue. When I came here yesterday at the airport, leaving from London, I overheard 3 people talking. One was an engineer, one was a doctor, and one was an economist. And I know it's not polite to listen to people talking, but I know you do, so I don't mind sharing my story either. The doctor said, we have the oldest profession in the world. The other 2 looked at him and said, how so? Well, you go back to the book of Genesis, and in the book of Genesis, you will see that Eve came out of Adam, came out of the ribs, both patients survived, first successful operation, doctor's oldest profession. The engineer said, I don't think so. I think we have the oldest profession. How so, the engineers? Well, think about all this chaos that was there. We created the universe, made everything turn around everything and function. Anybody that can create order out of chaos is an engineer. So the engineers have the oldest profession. And the economist said, I don't think so. I think the economists are the oldest profession. The 2 look at him in astonishment, and he said, because who creates chaos in the first place? And I think that's exactly where we find ourselves and why it's so crucial that a key industry like fashion is going to step up to the plate, as you've heard from previous players. A 1.8 trillion industry that is going to well over $3 trillion needs to carry its weight, otherwise we're not going to get there. In 1859, Charles Dickens wrote a book which was called The Tale of Two Cities. It deals with London and Paris. It says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was a spring of hope and a winter of despair. And I think that's where we find ourselves at the global stage. There is no doubt that in the last 40 years, we have lifted more people out of poverty than at any time in human history. In fact, the original Millennial Development Goals, which were set by Kofi Annan, to halve the number of people living in poverty, we actually achieved that from 2000 to 2015. At that time, defined as $1.25 a day, a great achievement. Our GDP in the last 50 years has grown by more than 3-fold, whilst the population has doubled. More people are going to school than at any time in human history. More people have access to health care than any time in human history. Although lots to do, more women have more rights than they've ever had in human history. People live longer, healthier lives. It's a good time to be born today and take my comments in that context. However, as Dickens said, it's also the worst of times. In this world, especially since the crisis of 2007, 2008, people call the financial crisis, became an economic crisis, some people would argue a political crisis. At the end, it was a rude awakening, to some extent a moral crisis about what we were doing. I think we were discovering increasingly more so that a system of growth that relies on overconsumption, enormous levels of debt at private and government level, and frankly leaving too many people behind, is ultimately a system that is not sustainable. The crisis of 2007, 2008 has also made people realize that in our system, the banks might have been too big to fail, but ultimately the people were too small to matter. Johan Rockström, not far from here, ran until he moved to Potsdam recently, the Stockholm Resilience Institute. The Stockholm Resilience Institute simply maps the health of this planet with 9 key indicators. On 4 of those, climate change being the most urgent one, we've already surpassed what people would call minimal acceptable levels. 18 of the last 20 years were the hottest years on record. For the first time in history, we're getting closer to a negative feedback loop on climate. When methane gets released with the permafrost and temperature rising, you get an enormous multiplier effect on global warming. We're well on track to about 3.2 degrees, which frankly we cannot afford. Even today, as we live, the Living Planet report from the World WWF, World Wildlife Fund, points out that we're losing species at a rate of 1,000 times more, up to 1,000 times more, than the normal patterns we've seen in the history of mankind. I would argue that in the last 30, 40 years of our lives, we have done more damage to this planet than in its 5 billion years of existence. Now, what gives us the right to do this? We've heard various definitions of sustainability. But in the end of the day, it's as simple as this. Sustainability is putting the interest of your children and their children ahead of your own personal greed. And unfortunately, too many people haven't discovered that yet. Hubert Reeves, who is a philosopher in Canada, he said it very well in one of his books, when he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. People think it's a battle between man and nature. It's not. It's a battle for our survival. Nature will survive. In fact, they'll laugh if we're not here anymore. Mother Nature doesn't negotiate. In fact, she's rapidly sending us our invoices. Every day now in the papers we read about droughts or floods. Many of the geopolitical crises that we see in the world have their origins in climate change. Some people would argue the Syrian crisis was preceded by enormous droughts the years before that got too many people to move into the cities and caused the spark to explode. The human caravan you see in Latin America moving north is a caravan of desperation, driven by climate change. What used to take a Peruvian fisherman 1 hour to earn a decent living is now taking him over 24 hours. If you're a coffee grower or a cocoa grower in many parts of those worlds, you've seen your prices collapse. It's a caravan of desperation. According to the World Bank, at its current trajectory, climate change is risking to push about 100 million people more into poverty. The second issue that I like to point out next to climate change is probably income inequality. We've talked about social compliance in this industry and some of the challenges you have, major challenges, may I add. Last year, for the first year in human history, half the world's population, the poorest half, 3.8 billion people, saw their combined wealth go down by 11%. It's the first time that the poorest people, who live on $1.75 a day, has any of you tried that? Saw their combined wealth go down by 11%, whilst the billionaires in this world so their combined wealth go up by 12%. The increase of 12% for the billionaires is $900 billion. It's about $2.5 billion alone. Just that money would put the 246 million children in education that are currently deprived of it. Just that money going to healthcare would probably save anywhere between 8 to 10 million lives globally. A world where too many people feel that they're not fully participating or being excluded from will ultimately reject itself. And that is what we're seeing. From the yellow jackets to the extinction rebellions, I would argue the election results in many of the countries we're seeing, the Green Deal movements, and many other things that are happening around us. Now, it's tough. It's tough to be a CEO. I was 10 years a CEO, just stepped down. Don't like to call it retirement because it sounds you were tired before and you're tired again. So I hate that thing. But the average length of a publicly traded company now has dropped, the average length of a CEO has dropped to 4.5 years. We simply don't have the right leaders to be able to cope with the environment that we're facing. The average length of a publicly traded company when I was born was 67 years. It's now dropped to below 17 years. It's damn hard to survive in this environment. And yes, the challenge might be daunting to some people. We need to decarbonize the global economy. We're carbon junkies. We don't know how to do this. We've heard that we need to move to a circular, or I would call cradle-to-cradle regenerative economy. We don't know how to do that either. François-Henri rightfully so said we need to move the financial markets to the longer term. If we don't create that space to deal with issues like climate change or food security or poverty alleviation, we will never get there. We don't know how to move the financial market to the longer term. In fact, it feels it's getting shorter and shorter with the amount of money we've put into global economies desperately trying to chase returns. And then finally, we need to have an economic system that is more inclusive. That doesn't work for the few, but that works for the many. Now, all of this would be easy in the history of mankind if we would democratically elect the right governments, have very capable people running this, and they would provide us with the rules, laws, regulations, and frameworks. But unfortunately, at a time that many of our issues are becoming more global, climate change, cybersecurity, financial markets, we are unfortunately seeing that most of the governments are shrinking to their own territories, equally becoming shorter and shorter term, not really very able to correct some of these broader underlying causes and drive these system changes, and become very reactive. Desperately driven by being re-elected in the next cycle, most likely 3 or 6 months away. We simply don't have the time anymore to address the major issues. And our global governance is equally falling short. In fact, most of the institutions that we have created to deal with this global governance deals from 1944, when by coincidence 44 countries went together to sign what was known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, the forerunners of the WTO, the OECD, Security Council, IMF, and many, World Bank, and many of the other institutions. Anybody who runs a business here, anybody would have had 10, 15, 20, I would argue 30, 40 times a change in strategy since 1944 to simply survive. So here we are, 4 major systems changes and a political or governance environment that's not as conducive. So what do we do? What do we do? We can be cynical, we can be skeptical, or are we going to rise to our challenge? Viktor Frankl said it well in his book Man's Search for Meaning, where he simply said, when they built the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, they forgot to build the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast. We've benefited from a political environment and a freedom to create our companies, to create our industry, to do all these wonderful things that have made us feel independent, wealthy to some extent. But you cannot have that liberty without that responsibility. And if the governments cannot take this for now, then why don't we step up to the plate? Business simply cannot be a bystander in a system that gives it life in the first place. If we don't take that responsibility, who will? Now, it might sound complex to all of us what we have to do, but actually we have a plan. We have a plan. I work a lot with the blind and deafblind. It was my own foundation in Africa, where we have 25,000 blind children in school. And I'm a chair of the Perkins School for the Blind, which has as a slogan, all we see is possibilities. One of their students was Helen Keller. And Helen Keller said, the worst thing actually is, and she was blind and deaf, by the way, spoke 7 languages. She said, the worst thing actually is not being blind. The worst thing is having eyes and not being able to see. The worst thing is having eyes and not being able to see. That is where we are right now. In September 2015, 193 countries came together at the UN and signed what is now called the Sustainable Development Goals. The sequence to the first 15 years, the Millennial Development Goals. It halved the number of people in poverty. Why not finish the job in the next 15 years? Its goal is very simple, to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. What's wrong with that? To not leave anybody behind. It can be done. It can be done. 17 goals. Talking about peace, talking about planet, talking about the people, talking about partnerships, and yes, talking about prosperity. 17 goals, 169 targets. It's a little bit complex. And I know a business person doesn't like to deal with complexity. If they can remember the name of their wives, the business they're in, and how much money they make, that's about it. So getting down to these 17 targets, we created a Commission for Business and Sustainable Development. We asked Mark Malloch-Brown, one of the UN undersecretaries, to chair this. We put about 30 commissioners together around the world. And just focusing on food and land use, cities, energy systems and health and well-being, we found an opportunity of $12 trillion and 380 million job creations at a time that we need it most. This is probably the biggest business plan that we have in the world. Goal number 1, poverty alleviation. Goal number 2, food security. Goal number 5, gender equality. Goal number 13, climate action. Goal number 4, education. Goal number 16, peace and justice. Deals with rule of law, absence of corruption. Goal number 17, partnerships. Look them up. The cost of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals is about $3 to $5 trillion a year. Might sound like a lot of money for all of us, certainly does to me, but it's only about 3 to 5% of the global economy. Now, it happens to be that all the overseas development aid of all the countries together is only 160 billion. So you won't get there. The private sector is over 60% of the global economy, 80% of the financial flow, and 90% of the job creation. If we don't involve the private sector, we will not be able to do it. It's as simple as that. We need to all get involved. We need to use these billions to unlock these trillions. And by the way, it's the best business plan we have. I would argue this if I had more time, but I would argue that on each of these 17 goals, we are already incurring today costs that are higher than the implementation of all of the goals. You understand me? And we're scrambling to get more profitability and growth. Goal number 5, gender equality. Just giving women the same land rights, finance access, or education would unlock the global economy, according to McKinsey, by $26 trillion. If you look at climate change, we're already incurring, according to the IMF, 2 years ago, total cost of climate change, which makes 8 million people die prematurely from air pollution, which gives us enormous volatilities in food prices, which causes the enormous disasters, weather-related events we've seen. $5.3 trillion. Just goal number 13, more than the implementation of all of the goals. And I'm not even talking about goal number 16 of peace and justice. We're spending actually 10 to 12% of our global GDP 2 to 3 times more than the implementation of all of these goals on conflict prevention and wars. And yes, the numbers are going up. It's good for our GDP to produce weapons. It's bad for our GDP to have peace. If we don't change the measures of what we call success, as François-Henri said, we treasure what we measure, we're simply not going to get there. So we all have a role to play. We all have a role to play. We cannot be bystanders in systems that give us life in the first place. Technology helps. I found out yesterday that some of you are working on making leather out of mushrooms. I'd love to eat them for my meal soon. And some of these other wonderful things that you have. But frankly, to solve the issues that we have today, we don't need more technology, we don't need more PhDs, we frankly don't need to send more people to Mars or Pluto to find the answer. What we're lacking simply is the human willpower. Do we care? It's my only question. Do we really care? We know how to grow food. We're actually so good at it that we waste 30 to 40% of what we produce. That alone would be the third biggest climate emitter after China and the US if it were a country. And yet 846 million people go to bed hungry every night in this world, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. It only takes 10% of that food that we waste, by the way, to let these people not go to bed hungry. We know how to build houses. Yet, in the US, 550,000 homeless go now to cities of San Francisco or Seattle. You'll be surprised. It's worse than what you see in many places in Africa, and the numbers are going up. And certainly we know how to provide a little piece of bar soap to get people to wash their hands and avoid the diseases like diarrhea or pneumonia that still kill 4 million children every year before the age of 5. We have the answers. What we miss is the willpower. What we miss is the leadership. We need more leaders that are purpose-driven, that understand that by putting the interest of others ahead of their own, they're better off themselves as well. Leaders that can work in partnership. As François-Henri was saying, the famous African proverb that if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. Leaders that understand the power of purpose. Now, I'm convinced that we have many of these leaders in this room. And one of them, actually, I'm going to introduce in a minute, which is Brune, one of the very promising and upcoming politicians, as I call it. I've long decided that if the politicians would be younger, and if there would be more politicians be females, the world would already be a better place. But she's taken the courage with the president of the French Republic, President Macron, to really use the G7, which otherwise would have become a useless body of statements and not implementations, to really look at tipping points, to get the right people together to see how we can move things forward. Not to worry about the naysayers. The direction is clear. Frankly, there's no CEO who wants more unemployment or more people going to bed hungry or die earlier from air pollution. We know what we have to do. But to focus with the ones that are willing, the real leaders, to creating these tipping points. And we're doing that in areas of biodiversity, oceans, climate, fashion industry being obviously a big part of it, and yes, the financing for development. And sure, we feel uncomfortable. But one of the questions I asked is, do we care? And one of the traits of leadership is to have courage, which we might have forgotten, but actually comes from the French word cœur, heart. You cannot get to these targets or set a little bit of an uncomfortable KPI at times if you don't work with both the heart and the brain, and indeed, if you don't do that in partnership. In fact, I was very intrigued to see that the Latin word for fashion actually means people acting together. Besides all the other wonderful things that you've said about this industry, let's start to act together and bring a higher level of purpose to all what we're doing. I am convinced that this can be a great industry. I am convinced that this can be the standard setter for other industries. But I also know that if you don't do it, I worry. I worry for the future of my children and their children. I worry for the ones already currently left behind. Because we won't be able to implement these Sustainable Development Goals if this industry doesn't change drastically. It doesn't matter if you are number 1, 2, or 3 on causing ocean pollution or climate change or biodiversity. We need you. We simply can't do it without you in the sheer numbers that we have. So do you care is the question that is only for you to answer. But let me tell you one thing. You're damn fortunate to be here today. You're damn fortunate. Congratulations, you made it past the age of 5. You didn't have to go to bed hungry. Most likely, like me, you lived in a country that provided your free education. We had 6 children at home. My father was a victim of the Second World War, couldn't go to school or university, ended up in a factory. But thanks God, the government paid, otherwise I wouldn't have been standing here. We're lucky people. Independent. Can do what we want, work for what we want, and bring our passions to life. Well, let me tell you something. You've won the lottery ticket of life, but you've done nothing for it. At best, you can blame your parents. You belong to 2% of the world population. And if you belong to 2% of the world population, my message is simply that it is your duty to put yourselves to the service of the other 98%. It was the Dalai Lama who said it very well when he said that if you seek enlightenment, just simply to enhance yourself and your position, you miss purpose. But if you seek enlightenment for yourself, to enable you to serve others, then you are with purpose. My message very simply to this industry is, live your lives with purpose. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Here we have Brune. We have to sit down.
I think so, yeah.
We think so. Yeah, I need to adjust my mic. That works. Brune, thanks for joining us, and obviously in a very busy time, you're coming all the way here. I know you were in Germany and other areas to work on the climate change agenda, which is very important. But we have this wonderful G7 coming up, and France has taken that responsibility this year. Tell us a little bit about the ambitions of the G7, if you want.
Well, several things. But first, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you to Eva, thank you to you, thank you, of course, Your Royal Highness. Thank you because you're all leaders in your field. And frankly speaking, one of the problems that I have when I try to design policies and implement them is that we simply lack leaders. So I'm not going to do a whole speech on leadership, because you've done that more than well, and François-Henri as well, and all of the previous speakers. But I just wanted to say thank you to start with. So talking about leadership, I think we also have a leader in President Macron, and I'm not saying that because he appointed me. I'm saying that because his vision for the G7 is that we need to make it meaningful, we need to make it useful. We know that a lot of countries a lot of citizens around the world are choosing and are voting for leaders that actually wonder or question the very value of international collaboration. And yet we all know, and I think more than 48 countries are here, we know that international collaboration is absolutely key. But why are citizens wondering whether it's useful? It's because all these international meetings, I'm not talking about this one, I'm talking about negotiations and G7s, they're boring, they're useless. Or I think they are, but they don't see the value of it. So how do we change that? Well, by just focusing on action, because that's what we need. Yeah. That's what people see at the end of the day. So instead of, as you said, Paul, instead of signing communiques and statements that nobody reads, not even the policymakers who sign it, well, we decided that we were going to focus on actions. And so with your help, with the help of a lot of people in the room, what we're doing is that we're working on achieving tipping points in a few key areas so that it shows results for people. For example, we're going to be working and we're bringing together, because we want to change the cooling system. Sounds obvious, but the warmer it gets, the more AC and air conditioning you need to buy. And so the warmer it gets, the warmer it gets. That's the vicious cycle. So what we're working on, it's not very sexy, it's not very glamorous, but it's really impactful. We want to change the standards of energy efficiency for AC, air conditioning, for instance. Yeah. And it sounds trivial, but that's the thing that we want to do. This will have a concrete impact. And we want to do the same with fashion.
That itself, by the way, is 0.5% of global warming.
Exactly.
Or air conditioning, potentially 1%.
Potentially 1%, as you said.
It's a very important thing.
Absolutely.
And how do you see fashion fit in from where you're sitting?
Well, first of all, fashion, because it speaks to everybody. That's also what we need. Talking about CO2 emissions and reduction and talking about all of that is great, but people need to see a change in their daily lives. So it's also one of the reasons why we chose fashion. Why also? Because it's so complex, fashion and the world of fashion, and it's such a global issue that we need that sort of international fora to actually work on it and take it and try and change policy making at the global level. So that's also one of the reasons why we decided to focus on fashion.
Yeah. And you also are working with other industries next to fashion. What's probably good to point out is some of the currents that we're seeing in other industries might also give us some ideas of what is possible and what is not possible.
Absolutely. And perhaps another reason why we chose fashion is also because fashion has an impact everywhere, on every single field. Social, but when you look at the environment, it's the ocean with all the plastics, that is produced, for example, but also nature. We talked about, we all wearing cotton, but it has, 25% or 24% of the world's pesticides are used for cotton. So what we want to make also is demonstrate and show and make sure that fashion is aware of its impact, which is cross-cutting. And so one of the objectives of the G7 also is stop looking at, the environment in silos. We say adaptation, mitigation, the ocean, just as if everything was something different. And so we want to bring it all together. And I think fashion is perhaps the best example of that is possible and that it's achievable.
Yeah. How do you ensure, with France having obviously seen some of the signs of this discontent, even more so than in other countries, although it's starting to happen everywhere, how do you ensure that what you're working on with the G7 actually gets through to the people that we need to serve?
Well, through several things. I think really the Yellow Vests movement in France has sent a very strong political message to politicians, obviously. And I think we need three things. First is coherence. So it's not good to do some, I don't know, on one side of your business, you do a bit of, you do good, but the rest, you keep polluting. It no longer works. Citizens just see it. It's like, in France, the Yellow Vest movement just started because of the carbon tax. Yeah. And so, citizens were telling me, well, if I drive from Paris to Marseille, I'm paying the tax full steam. But if I fly, I don't pay a carbon tax. What's the point? I don't understand it. Yeah. So first, what we need is consistency. Exactly. Yeah. Consistency. Second, we need transparency. People need to know what's going on and whether we're reaching targets or not. They want to see progress. They want us to report on progress. And third, they want accountability. Yeah. So you need to set, and the overarching, I think, thing that they want is they want industry, they want governments, they want all of us to do the maximum we can. It sounds very obvious, but no one does the maximum. No one. So you need to take your capacities and identify whether you're using them at the maximum level. And so that's really the learning, you know, these three key pillars. And that's what we want to use for the G7. And that's the methodology. And through the One Planet Summit, and Paul, thank you, you've played really a key role in helping us form all these coalitions. So how does it work? Just concretely, for example, how do we achieve impact? How do we show that we are consistent, transparent, accountable? We choose one specific topic or area. I talked about air conditioning. And we try and bring 20 to 25% of the market, of all the stakeholders of a market, to actually commit to specific targets that are ambitious, really hard to achieve, but actually they commit to that, and then start implementing it. So what it means is that the 80 or 75% of the market that hasn't joined, you can point finger at them. Yeah. They have no excuse. Yeah. And it also gives courage, or it shows and it sends a signal to policymakers that now is the time to regulate, that they also have no excuse if they don't regulate. Yeah. So that's what we want to do, and we've identified about 10 key areas in the field of the ocean, as I said, nature, biodiversity, climate, and finance. Finance is also critical. We need to change the rule of the game.
What I'm encouraged about is that, based on also what you are saying, there are two things in there, important for this industry as well, is trust is low everywhere. Trust in CEOs, equally low as in politicians or other institutions, trust in companies. And we cannot rebuild that trust if we don't work with a higher degree of transparency. Absolutely. And when the transparency is there, the companies that provide that transparency actually get rewarded. Whilst many CEOs think, oh, that's a bigger risk, you actually get rewarded for that, as François-Henri said as well. Transparency builds trust. That is that basis for prosperity. Absolutely. We see it on climate change, that companies that disclose their carbon footprint, or they go back sourcing disclosure into their total value chain, tend to actually do better, more responsible management, better anticipating of these issues. McKinsey just calculated that companies that are more CSR-driven actually have a 46% higher profit growth over time and equally a turnover growth. And so it's not surprising, I think, that the industry should move into that direction. If you have one wish, an ambitious wish for the fashion industry for the G7, what would that be? What would blow off your socks? What should they do to roll up their sleeves?
Well, the list would be very long. But I think if I had one thing, it would be first join the Fashion Pact. Yeah. Because it has a set of very concrete targets and objectives. And most importantly, second, I would say tackle the issue of waste and discarding. You know, too many companies feel okay with just destroying the clothing or the shoes or that haven't been worn or that they haven't sold. That's no longer possible. That is no longer possible. It's shocking. It's just simply, it doesn't make sense. So in France, we're going to pass a law that makes it no longer, that makes it unlawful to do that. It's a big revolution for the sector. It's been really hard to come to that level. We've had, really leaders in that field, and I want to thank again François-Henri Pinault. I think without CEOs like you, it would be impossible for policymakers to actually do their work and to achieve things. And so citizens and consumers at the end would become, rightly so, very cynical. And then they start voting for people who they think speak the truth. Yeah. I'm not going to quote leaders, but that's when then you enter the vicious circle. So that would be my wish.
No, that's good. And I think everybody here would support that. Just to give a little bit of courage in terms of trying to feel uncomfortable. Just last week, 210 mayors of European cities, big cities, by the way, signed a commitment to be what is called net zero by 2050, which is what is needed to stay at 1.5 degrees. We got the whole Consumer Goods Forum to sign a commitment to end deforestation, a use of materials from deforestation by 2020. And even the heavy emitter industries, steel, aluminum, cars, glass, shipping, maritime, and aviation, which is about 30% of the emissions. We now have in cement, for example, over 20% of the companies saying, I can be net zero, I can stay in my business net zero well before 2050. So if these industries are making these commitments and are actually starting to deliver on this, I tell you, from a CEO perspective, I'd love to be in the fashion industry. It's a piece of cake. So it's,
would you like to be a policymaker, though?
It's a piece of cake.
Or a politician, I would say.
If I start my life again, I'll move into this industry. And it's fun, I've discovered. A final personal question. Being a young politician in France.
Aha. Can I say joker? Or I was saying first joker. Well,
what do you enjoy the most? Not the challenges.
What do I enjoy the most?
Yeah. Why did you do it?
The fact that some of the things that I've seen and that I used to find outrageous, such as, for example, the impact of fashion in the world, because I lived in India and Bangladesh. So I've seen it. I was in the water industry. And so I think being able to play a part in that, I think that's really rewarding. But that's also, what's also really difficult is that everybody thinks that because you're a politician, you have a magic wand and that you can just change everything overnight. That's not the case. And that's why I want to use the fashion industry as really a symbol of where everybody is actually comes out of its comfort zone and where we stop the blame game. Because of the sheer impact of the fashion industry in the world, because everybody dreams about that. I think that's really the industry that can make the difference. And I think now a challenge for the industry is, because it's great, we're talking about mostly the luxury sector. And it's great because they have the thought leadership and the moral, the influence. But think about a poor person who wants to buy a pair of trousers. Why would they have to buy a pair of trousers that destroy the planet? So if you're poor, by default, your impact on the planet is stronger. Yeah. That's no longer possible. Perfect. That's not possible. Right. So help us also design clothes for the masses, for everybody, that is sustainable. Otherwise, it is so unfair, and that's no longer acceptable. That's what we want.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brune Poirson, Minister of Environment for France. We love you,
Polman.
and you can count on our support.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you to Paul and Brune. So there's no break as scheduled in the programme because we've gone over. There's too much to talk about. But if you do need to excuse yourself, then please do, of course. I've been told to say you have to do it quietly, but I'm not offended easily. So if you need to go, you can. Also, if you are scheduled to take part in one of the workshops in the design studio, then please go and do that. And go and, get, what was it we were saying? Pull your sleeves up and get mucky. This morning, we have heard how you can innovate in the fashion industry to combat issues that we face collectively. And we have more than 40 solutions presented in the Innovation Forum, where each solution addresses one or more of the priorities in the CEO Agenda 2019. Because I think what is important is take out wisdom, advice, and practicality when it comes to genuinely changing. There is some more help and guidance to do that. I'm going to call upon my mate Simon. Over to you.
Hello everybody, welcome to the basement level. I'm here in the Innovation Forum, another one of the amazing things that are on offer here. Remember, as Eva said, just because there's stuff going on all day in the main stage, don't miss out on what's happening down here. So I want to talk to a couple of people that are showing. We're going to start with Vicky from Parley for the Oceans. Hi Vicky, how are you?
Hi, nice to meet you, Simon.
Nice to see you. So listen, tell me what you're doing. Tell me about the company and what you're doing here.
We're at Parley for the Oceans. We're an environmental organization that is working towards redesigning, avoiding and intercepting plastics, and transforming the marine debris into material that can be reused.
So we've all seen, I think, on the news, the terrible, terrible pollution that's in the ocean, primarily of plastic, that awful stuff that never disappears. Tell us what you do, how you gather it and what you do with it.
We organize within our NGOs, local communities, even governments in coastal regions collect that plastic, and then the plastic separated and then contained and then sent to our partners who are recyclers that convert the plastic into yarn or materials that can be put into items that are not single-use plastic.
Now, I think what's critical here is that this is not just about making sort of crafty, recycled-looking product. This is about fully profitable product that people can buy from Adidas and places like that. So, and there's no favor involved. This is a high quality product that they use to make high quality shoes. Can you show us something?
So our partnership with Adidas, our partnership started, they did not put the ocean plastic material into their linings or in some nondescript areas. They put it on their best product, the Ultra Boost shoe. They put it in their soccer jerseys, all performance items. And this was a really important statement because you have top athletes wearing the products and the garments are not falling apart. And this is a strong statement saying that materials that are single-use items, marine debris, are converted into desirable luxury products that perform.
So they're almost not single-use materials anymore. Isn't that great?
These and they never want to get rid of it. They hand it down. So it really becomes, that is the intention, is to create that type of product.
Fantastic. Well, Vicky, thank you. I encourage everybody to come down and check out Parley for the Oceans. And I believe your colleague Cyril's speaking on the main stage tomorrow. So thank you. We'll see you again. So now we're going to go across the hall and we're going to talk about water. Laura, hi, how are you?
Thank you.
So Laura, tell us what you're doing here.
Well, I'm here from WaterAid, and we're here with WWF and HSBC. And we're talking to brands and suppliers and companies about how they can put water at the heart of a sustainable future for the people and ecosystems in their apparel supply chains.
And you have a rather snazzy looking table here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, indeed. So our table has been designed on a marker-based system so that anybody can come, place the marker, and then deep dive into the information that is relevant to them.
Fantastic. And you're working with World Wildlife Foundation.
Yes, it's a really great partnership. So WaterAid, WWF and HSBC. But what's crucial is that we all know that water is such a precious resource, but we want people to think about it holistically. The environmental impact, making sure workers and communities have access to water, sanitation and hygiene, which of course is a human right, but also thinking about it in terms of a business risk as well.
I know that a lot of the innovation that's going on around sustainability is about using less water and purifying it better so that we can have more of it and not pollute so much of it. Great, well thank you very much. I encourage everyone to come down and have a look at this so we can work on saving water.
And people.